talk a little bit about terminology. I always like to share a bit around why should we be thinking about LGBTQIA plus populations or sexual and gender minorities. I will explain sort of what I mean with that terminology in a moment, but I want to talk on the context and really think about the lived experiences of our community members. I will spend some time sharing about the research that I'm doing in the Alzheimer's disease space and some of the work in caregiving. A big piece I like with the talk is always to leave you with some tools. So my hope is you'll leave this thinking like, oh, we really need to collect sexual orientation, sex assigned at birth, and gender identity in the research that I'm doing, whether it's for a dissertation or for a current project. I'll share with you some of the current work that's coming in the future that I'm not kind of talking as much about the results from because we're in the field collecting data, and then leave some time to hear from you on your thoughts. And hopefully if you have questions, I can answer them for you. I'm just going to do this. Nope. Okay. So first, a lot of my work focuses on thinking about Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And so I want to share sort of the language I'm going to use today and get you thinking about this. So you may hear the term cognition. And when I'm talking about that, I'm really thinking about people's abilities in terms of a range of memory and thinking skills. So that's what I'm referring to. It could include things like language, or we think of like executive function, or like, can people multitask, right? And what is their ability to do complex tasks? You'll also hear the word dementia. And so dementia, I think about this more as an umbrella term that reflects many different types of dementia. The most common one, and really where the NIH is kind of focused on supporting research, is around Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease and related dementias is another term that I use as an umbrella term. It's really focused on this is where NIH, you get a unique score if you use the term Alzheimer's disease or related dementias, and that means you're focusing on something around memory and thinking. So the most common symptom that we see for Alzheimer's disease is around memory loss. So a lot of what I'm looking at are memory loss related concerns and how that impacts people's everyday. So their ability to socialize, to work, to maintain their daily lives. So that's where we're thinking. You'll hear the term as well around mild cognitive impairment. This is where people have more subtle changes in their memory and thinking skills. It doesn't meet what we would consider Alzheimer's disease, but we are seeing that it impacts their daily life in a way that is not expected with normal aging. And then you'll also hear subjective cognitive decline. This is really a way for us at a population level, when we cannot objectively measure someone's memory and thinking skills, we ask them to self-report. Are they having any problems with their memory and thinking that's been getting worse? We may also ask if it's impacting their daily lives, but that cannot be very sensitive. This could be due to their own perceptions that they're having problems, but they're not. It could be due to poor sleep. It can be related to depression, or maybe they have a chronic disease or something that's impacting sort of their memory, and it's not a pre-dementia kind of, we call it like prodromal symptom of what we would see of dementia. You'll also hear under this umbrella, I don't do as much looking at subtypes. So vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia. I do a little work in Parkinson's disease, and Lewy bodies are sort of the main marker of what we see in Parkinson's disease, but we can also see as those kind of impact the brain, someone can get Lewy body dementia. So I want to jump into the language. Today, I'm using the NIH term of sexual and gender minority. Whenever I say this, I like to say, never use this with the community. They do not know what this is. Many people are like, what? I'm not that. Or we ask participants, gender minority, and cisgender women will be like, I'm a gender minority, right? And so it doesn't really reflect the language that our communities use. This is really reflecting in 2016, the NIH designated sexual and gender minorities as a health disparities population, and they came up with this language, right? And so I'll tell you how I'm using it and how the NIH defines it. So sexual minority, this reflects people who identify their sexual orientation as something that is not purely heterosexual. So they could be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or they use another term to describe their sexual orientation, but they do not identify as heterosexual. Gender minorities are individuals who may identify as transgender, non-binary, or they use a different term. And really, it's that their gender identity and/or expression does not align with what society says your gender identity or expression should be based on your sex assigned at birth. So what's unique about this is that it also includes intersex people. Intersex people are born with differences in their sexual development. So they may have differences in their genetics, in how their body responds to sex hormones, or their reproductive anatomy. We don't have a place to put intersex people, so they put them in gender minority. That's not really an identity, it's something people are born with. So that's just something to note when I'm talking about these, how we refer to it. Cisgender, I've used this term already. These are individuals that do not identify as transgender. So their gender identity aligns with their sex assigned at birth. It's important to note that you could be a sexual minority or a gender minority, or you could be both, right? So an example is you could be a lesbian transgender woman, as an example, or you could be a heterosexual transgender woman, and so you would only be a gender minority. In aging work, but also when all of you are doing work that thinks about life course, we often need to re-ask sexual orientation and gender identity because it may change over the lifespan. But what I recommend is if you've already asked sex assigned at birth, that doesn't change. So you don't have to re-ask that if you have it. Right? But if you don't have it, then you may want to do a two-step approach where you ask sex assigned at birth as well as gender identity. I also you'll see in my talk some, I may use another umbrella term, LGBTQIA+. For this, it reflects the diversity within the community. What I always recommend is that we use the language that our communities use to identify themselves. So an example I often have, one of the terms on here, transsexual, is an outdated term. We would not use this with community members, but I have a good friend, she's 80 years old, she was at Stonewall. She describes herself as a transsexual, right? And so that's the term I use when we're talking, if that were, I don't really use that term often, I don't need to, but if it were to come up and I were to describe it, I would use the term transsexual with her when we're talking about it, right? But for other community members, I would not use it because it's stigmatizing. As well as with older populations, the term queer can often be loaded in how people have experienced harm. We are including it, but many older people don't like that term. So you want to be careful, you need to know the community you're working with and the language you use. I also really love this image from the trans student educational resources group. What I like about this image is just that it reflects that gender identity, expression, sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, and emotional attraction, all of these are on a continuum. So in research, we like to put people in categories. But that's not how real life works. And so this can be a challenge. So I'm going to give you some best practices, but what I always recommend is if you ask questions about this and you have another option or people to write in, as you start seeing people endorse certain language, you add that as a category that they could select from. So that'll be important to really think about centering your work based on the language our communities use. As well as here, just to give an example, I give, and this is outdated, already, but it's terms that gender minority people or gender diverse people may use to describe their gender identity. And you can see here just the range of terms that are used. And so it's important that, again, we just are open to learning this language and using what our community members use to self-describe themselves. So I'm going to shift to talking about why inclusion matters. And this is especially, I think, important with what we're seeing socially and politically in our country. But also, I do a lot of work with older adults, right? And so when we think about their experiences and why we should be thinking about promoting inclusion, I think this can really frame that. And so one of the hallmarks, I mentioned Stonewall already, but in our country, and still what we're seeing today, prior to sort of 1969, but it was even happening in many places during that, it was not uncommon for SGM people to be arrested for their identity, right? So police raiding of LGBTQ plus bars, right? Incarcerating people. They would often have their picture posted in their local newspaper, which would often affect, they would lose their job. Maybe their family doesn't know, so they would be stigmatized in their communities. They could lose housing, you name it, many resources. And so when we think about elders and kind of what they've had to overcome, I think it's important that we put it within the context that they have not had the same opportunities to have good health, but also to have access to some of the basic needs. And so we think about really a major moment in LGBTQ plus rights happening with the Stonewall riots in the early hours of 1969, June 28th, where we've heard stories of that trans women of color were leading the movement. There isn't a good documentation of our history, but there's a story where the police raided early this morning and were pulling out what was said either a transgender woman or a drag queen. And as the police officer was pulling her into the back of the vehicle, her heel went up and hit him. And he began to attack her with his club. And this led to the community saw that and actually described hearing metal hit bone and started throwing bricks at the police officer and other objects. And this led to multiple days of riots where basically, and we saw this happening in other cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, where basically the community said enough, right? We're enough of the police brutality. And so this is why we celebrate Pride in June, to really honor this iconic moment in history of sort of the movement of saying enough of the brutality, we want equality. And so that is a big piece that we have to think about of many of the older adults that I do research with. I shared a good friend of mine that was at Stonewall, right, went through these periods of being fearful about just living. So here I highlight just a brief timeline. Something I want to point out is this is very gay oriented. It does not really reflect as much about transgender rights or events. But here I highlight 1969 with the Stonewall riots. 1970 is the first Pride Parade. We see the flag is created in 1978. Then we see here 1993 is when the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy is signed into law, that you cannot openly serve as an LGBT person in the military. It isn't until 2011 that it's repealed, right? And then if we think about iconic pieces around access to wealth and resources, we do not see protection for marriage equality until 2015. And then we see some movement in LGBT rights, but we also heard, I think it was in like 2020 or 2021, when we heard that transgender people could not serve openly in the military, right? And so there's been major pieces that have been happening still today that impact the community. One example is what we're seeing across the United States in terms of laws that are being passed to restrict youth from accessing gender-affirming care. And this map is also out of date. And some of the major issues with this is that we're seeing this is impacting everybody, not just youth. So you may see in the news, no one knows how to apply these laws. So instead, what they do is just stop providing all gender-affirming care to anyone. And so this has created huge issues, as well as there's been studies to show that this is impacting the broader community's mental health, everybody, not just the trans community. So huge issues. And something that really stands out to me in terms of concerns is as we saw these laws pass, the increases in hate crimes and murders of transgender people have gone up. And so again, it's an example of what we're seeing socially of, the impacts. I think within this context, we often hear, why are maybe SGM people reluctant to disclose their identity? And so we also have to think about, right, it's not until 1973 that being a homosexual was no longer considered a mental health disorder. And then still today, for transgender people to receive care, they have to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So we're pathologizing their identity and how that impacts people's lived experience. It's important that we think about it, as well as I've shared some of the historical laws, and still what we see across many states are lacks of protection. Even if there's federal, state laws that don't protect around housing, employment, and healthcare. And if you don't have the resources to fight this, even if federally it's illegal, you're not going to be able to, fight an eviction or a loss of a job. So these create unique pieces. It's also important for us to think about how this intersects for people who are diverse or from other marginalized identities. So an example, we can think about people of color, we can think about people living with HIV or living with a disability, and how that impacts their experiences. And why I bring all this up is because when we think about cornerstones for successful aging, some of the key pieces we know that are important are economic security, having good social connections, and access to healthcare. Well, these are all areas that for the SGM community, they have not had the same opportunities. So this is why we would expect to see health disparities for SGM people. So it's not really good in terms of knowing the exact number of people in our country that are older. Current estimates are pretty crude. We estimate it's more than 3 million people identify as LGBTQIA+. We know that more than a million of them are 65+ in terms of the aging of the baby boomer generation. But estimates aren't really good because none of our population-based or national studies ask about sexual orientation and gender identity. So we have to have crude estimates based on what we see from things like the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. We know the community is very diverse in terms of race, ethnicity. So 1 in 5 identify as a person of color. And then we know many members of the community, at least a third, are living at or below the 200% poverty level. So we see how these issues can impact the community when we think about health disparities, right? Access to things like caregiving support, if they're less likely to be married or they are less likely to have had children. They're 2 to 3 times more likely to be living alone. If they're fortunate to have a caregiver, many of them don't have any resources to support that caregiver. And then I've shared already what's happening around access to healthcare, both historically, but today. So I want to shift now to telling you a little bit in terms of Alzheimer's disease and the caregiving research. What do we know? What are we kind of seeing for sexual and gender minorities? So the first data comes from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, or BRFIS. We did a study that looked at data from 2015 through 2018. And we looked at it across 25 states. who had decided to ask sexual orientation and gender identity, and also this subjective cognitive decline question. So both of the modules are optional. And so in this, they asked a subjective cognitive decline question that's during the past 12 months, have you experienced confusion or memory loss that has been happening more often or is getting worse? And what we found was that for SGM people, about 1 in 7 were saying they were having these problems, compared to around 1 in 10 for non-SGM or cisgender heterosexual people. So this makes us think, all right, are there some potential concerns in terms of dementia risk that we should be thinking about? So we went and looked at subgroups. And here what I wanted to highlight for you is where we're seeing the greatest concerns. So nearly 17% of lesbian cisgender women, bisexual cisgender people, people who identify their sexual orientation as another, and transgender individuals are reporting this subjective cognitive decline. We actually don't see it higher in gay cisgender men. And so we're not exactly sure why, but one thought is around privilege within the SGM community and thinking who holds most of the resources. And often it is the gay men who have most of the resources within the community. So maybe that's the reason why. We don't know. One thing that really stood out to us, and I've shared a little bit about mild cognitive impairment, but what we found is that for sexual and gender minorities experiencing this subjective cognitive decline, they were more likely to report that it was interfering with their daily lives. So more likely to be giving up day-to-day activities, needing help with household tasks, having, that it was interfering with their social activities, work, or volunteering. And these are actually some markers of what we see in mild cognitive impairment. So could be a potential concern that these are actually major problems. What we did not find a difference is that older adults do not want to talk to their care providers about having memory problems or Alzheimer's disease. So we didn't find a difference by sexual orientation or gender identity in that area. So important to note. So this brought me to the next work where I wanted to look at, well, we're seeing subjective cognitive decline. What are we seeing in terms of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias? And so I leveraged data from Kaiser Permanente in Northern California. They started collecting medical record data in 1996, and I have medical record data through 2015. For a cohort of 200,000 people who were 60 and older. And so then we went and looked, and uniquely in 2007, Kaiser asked sexual orientation, one of the first kind of leaders to look at this. And so in this, we had over 4,300 lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in the study. And then we had all of their health diagnoses and some demographics. So when we went to look at dementia, we found that the prevalence of dementia was lower for sexual minorities versus heterosexuals. But we found that they were being diagnosed with dementia at a younger age. So over a year earlier in terms of being diagnosed. We don't know necessarily what that means, right? Could it be accelerated aging? Could it be something else? We are controlling for things like their healthcare utilization. We also then went to model the longitudinal data, and we found that there were no differences for men, whether you were a sexual minority or not, in terms of your dementia risk. But what we did find is that there was a higher odds of dementia for lesbian and bisexual women compared to heterosexual women. And so we accounted for differences in race, marital status, income, education, as well as kind of controlling for some of the, the longitudinal nature of the data. So this to us suggests a potential signal or a potential area that we should really be thinking about in terms of why would we see higher rates of dementia for lesbian and bisexual women compared to heterosexual women. And often when I go to this literature, I have to look at work more with minorities. And so we see, for instance, higher rates of dementia for African Americans and Hispanic Latino communities. And so we're wondering if those could be some of the reasons. We did not find major differences in some of the chronic conditions or risk factors that we would expect. And what's unique is that for the LGBT or LGB group, they had higher education. And education's a protective factor for dementia. And we're seeing higher dementia in lesbian and bisexual women with higher education. So that to me is really interesting. And so it deserves further study. Some other work that's been happening, I want to share some of the work of some mentees that I've been working with. So one is Dr. Ethan Cicero, who's been looking at transgender adults and basically took what we did with Burfus, but looked at it in transgender people of color. So I shared with you before, right? It was around 17% for subjective cognitive decline. In transgender people of color, it's over 20%. So again, an area that we need to be thinking about. We've also done this in a sub-study where we're now trying to collect objective cognition using the telephone interview for cognitive status. This is sort of a small pilot that was supported by my K award. So they only wanted me to recruit 60 people and I did 61. And so we found that about a third of them were reporting these subjective memory problems and over 40% met possible cognitive impairment based on the tics. So again, this is a convenience sample, it's not generalizable, but again, a potential signal that suggests maybe we should be doing some more research to think about the community. Something that really stands out to me, and I've shared about the concerns for the trans community, there have been several studies that are leveraging Medicare beneficiary data for people that are 65 plus. They're mostly looking at broad chronic conditions, but me as a dementia researcher, go to the dementia numbers and I've been pretty alarmed of what we're seeing in terms of diagnosis for transgender people. So this is back looking at, I think it was 2015 data from CMS. And we found 18% of transgender people compared to 12% of cisgender have a diagnosis of dementia. There was a recent update where they looked at multiple years, so 2008 through 2017, and then broke it down by gender identity. And we see over 20% for transgender men and women with a diagnosis of dementia, compared to around 12 to maybe 14% in cisgender men and women. So this is an area I think that I hope scholars will really consider exploring and really concerning in terms of our transgender older adults, that we really need to be thinking about their needs around dementia and late life. There are also two national studies that have leveraged data. The first one from from Health and Retirement Study. And the second one was from I think it's the one at INSHAP. So I think we might have talked about this, right? And so both of those studies include either same-sex partners, or I think INSHAP actually asked sexual orientation. And so these two researchers looked at this and found in these population ones, so not a convenience sample, right, that basically nearly like 83% higher odds of cognitive impairment in both of these studies for sexual minorities. And so that to me suggests we are seeing some concerns around potential risks for dementia, because these are objective measures of cognition. I've also done a small study with intersex adults, so another group that experiences a lot of disparities and stigma in our society. So we did a sub piece just to look at this. It's not the same subjective cognitive decline measure, but over 40% of the adults in this study that were 40 plus were reporting problems with their memory and concentration. So again, a group that I think we need to really be thinking about around concerns for dementia. Finally, there are some unique pieces. We did a study leveraging data from the PRIDE study, and we had a module for people that were 50 and older, and we basically replicated measures from the health and retirement study in this cohort. And something that really stood out to us was to look at the rates of subjective cognitive decline for transgender people. And this is cross-sectional, but something that stood out to us is that transgender people with these memory problems were also reporting more problems with discrimination around healthcare. So if we're telling older adults to go get screened or talk to their doctor about their memory issues, we're likely going to see major barriers for our trans community members in terms of doing that. Finally, we also looked at it among LGBTQIA plus people living with Parkinson's disease. And what we found in this, Parkinson's disease is sort of behind in terms of other research in the Alzheimer's space, in terms of broader inclusion of diverse communities. But we looked at leveraging the Fox Insight data. So it's a cohort study of a large number of people with Parkinson's disease. And we found that LGBTQIA plus, as well as cisgender women, were reporting more discrimination when they go to seek care. And so we think that this, again, can be a barrier in terms of community members receiving access to treatment and other care services to promote their quality of life when they're living with Parkinson's disease. So another area that we think deserves further study. I want to shift into some of the caregiving work to share with you. So the caregiving space, what's unique for SGM people is that we see that they're more likely to be a caregiver than non-SGM people. We also see that they're more likely to say that they're going to be a caregiver in the next 1 to 2 years. So another issue around the needs. What also stands out to us in the research is they're more likely to have to help with more intense caregiving tasks. So more of those traditional like nursing related tasks, helping with toileting, helping with wound care, helping with administering medications. So all of the research that's been looked at caregivers in general show that these are related to high levels of stress, mental health challenges, and subsequent chronic diseases. So we think that this is an area that is going to be a very big concern around SGM caregivers. I highlight some data just from some national, not necessarily population-based, but studies from AARP that's looked at LGBTQ plus caregivers. And we see also a lot of fears around the use of long-term care services. So things like if you need respite care to get a break, or you need desperately to go on a vacation, they're fearful about accessing those services because of their, their care recipient being mistreated or having to go into a long-term care setting. So a lot of unique barriers and pieces around stress and not being able to manage health. So based on some of this research, me and a colleague looked at basically SGM caregivers of people with dementia and wanted to just understand. A lot of my work is just purely descriptive. Where is the current, what are their current health experiences? What are the current challenges? So we find about a third of them are living in a small town or a rural area. So that right there is a barrier to accessing services. 63% provide care to another sexual minority person that's living with dementia. 1 in 5 were providing care to a transgender person or a gender minority. And one in 3 were reporting that it was very difficult to afford the very basics. So we see an economic challenge for them. We are, I think, related to some of the heart pieces important. Most cared for their spouse or partner. Most were, on average, they were providing care for about 2 years. But what's unique is while they're caring for a partner, more than half of them do not live with their care recipient. And we also found a similar pattern where they were saying fear of using services. Most did not use any of the long-term care services, so like adult day or even transportation. We saw unique concerns in terms of health. So a third of them were reporting below average health status. Much like patterns I've shared, we see the greatest concerns for lesbian and transgender caregivers, and queer caregivers were reporting more discrimination. We saw high levels of stress. So 73% were reporting moderate to high levels of stress. About, nearly 80% were meeting based on the CESD, like a dementia or a depression screening, that they might have probable depression. And then we saw for SGM caregivers of color that they were reporting lower quality of life than whites. So again, thinking about that intersectionality piece. So I want to shift a little bit and at least share some positive things. I've been sharing all the negative, and then leave you with some thoughts and hopefully some tools. So the most exciting thing I wanted to share with you is that I've been part of a group in San Francisco to create the first LGBTQ plus co-designed adult day program. It's called Club 75. That's what the participants named it. And it's an incredible program that brings really seniors in greatest need. It's a partnership between Open House, a group that oversees LGBT senior housing, and Onlock, who is the group that founded the PACE model, program for all-inclusive care for the elderly. And so they are creating this unique program to, one, as a pipeline to get LGBTQ plus seniors into PACE, but also to create a sustainable and very welcoming co-designed adult day program. It's incredible. Like, I want to go there. Like examples I got to observe, right? They of course invited me when they were having good events to see, but like they did LGBT history talks. I got to participate in exercise classes that they were doing. And they also had an amazing like drag queen bingo out on the patio with all the participants. And the drag queens were seniors. They were not just people from the community. So it's just a really incredible program, and everything is based on the feedback of seniors. I show a picture there. The art on one of the walls was created by one of the members. So they're really focused on meeting the needs of the community. And it's just there's so much potential for us to build programming with our community members in mind. So I shared with you a little bit about, right, we either see similar or higher rates of Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment. And I really want to leave you with thinking about, if you want to work with the community, there's some recommendations I have. And the first is to really be thinking about resilience and the community, just what they've accomplished in terms of LGBTQ plus rights, you committing to learning. I shared the language, right? Just using the language that our communities members use, being open to learning about their needs. Think about trauma-informed care approaches. So many community members have experienced trauma in the past or are currently experiencing it, and to think about giving back. So in terms of like promoting resilience, I think it's honoring our community members as the pioneers, trailblazers. They might have been one of the people that threw the brick at Stonewall, or the person that was willing to stand at the courthouse when gay marriage was not allowed and to fight for it, right? Or the reason that many of us enjoy protections. Strive to really think about cultural humility. So specifically, right, when we think about that, it's a commitment to lifelong learning, critical self-reflection of your own biases, whether those are, unconscious or conscious biases, right? And really working to kind of work with community members to design research that's truly based on their needs. So thinking like, if transportation's a barrier and you're doing a study that requires people to show up on site, learn about that ahead of time so that you're not designing a study that won't work, right? So thinking about those things. And so humility, we're often thinking about its knowledge, attitudes, and skills. If you're interested in trauma-informed care, I can't go as much in detail of this. I encourage you to check out the SAMHSA model that kind of has these 6 principles around safety, building trust, creating peer support, collaboration, empowering the community, and honoring their cultural and historical backgrounds, and thinking about also the impact of gender. Resilience, I often think about this as being very similar to some of these domains of trauma-informed care, but it's really about this collaboration and building and co-learning. Like this co-learning piece is going to be so important. Many of the seniors that you would work with were part of the first prides. We're part of the first studies when we think about what was happening with HIV and AIDS, right? And so they know a lot about what will work, and we can find ways to work with them. I encourage you, if you want to do this research, think about hiring an LGBTQ plus senior to be on your team, you know, to help advise, whether it's a consultant or to help with recruitment. And then the biggest piece that I think is important in terms of building trust is to give back. And so to do this work, I show these pictures of just examples of how I do it. Show up. Show up. If you say you're going to be there, do it. Show that you care about this community. Whether it's like me getting to drive a Corvette during the, you know, or I think it was a Mustang, driving it during the Pride Parade, right? That was leading 2 of the Grand Marshals, 2 trans people, right? In that picture is my good friend Judy I mentioned, right? So just being there, showing up to events, but also going back to the community and sharing what you've learned so that they can make change. So I want to leave some recommendations. I mentioned some best practices we've been doing around sexual orientation and gender identity data. There are many reports that recommend this. We recently got questions added to the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center for the uniform data set. So here I just show you, these are the questions. We give a script. We had to come up with this because we were getting pushback about people will be offended if we ask these questions. We have not heard anything. We've looked at feasibility. Over 90% of participants complete these questions. So no one's being offended. We have not heard about anyone dropping out of a study because of asking these questions. It's mostly senior PIs that are uncomfortable with asking these questions or saying, we don't need to know about sex. And we're like, this is not sexual behavior, this is identity, but you actually should be asking about sexual behavior. So this is sort of the best practices. We do select all that apply. You see, we do include two-spirit identity, but we recommend only asking this of people from indigenous backgrounds. It's a spiritual term. It can be used both for sexual orientation or gender identity. And so it's important. And then I use a different term, and this is where we recommend eventually, if you start seeing other terms come up, that you think about adding those as a check all that apply. Yes, it's harder to analyze this data because no one falls into just one group, but you just figure it out, right? We can collapse depending on power. Sometimes you have to think about oversampling certain groups if you want to have the numbers, and that requires building trust with those groups. We also recommend the 2-step approach for asking sex assigned at birth and gender identity. We had to give in on this. I would recommend asking gender identity first and then asking sex assigned at birth, but the researchers of this group would not let us do it that way because it hasn't been cognitively tested, they said. But so this is what we recommend. In some studies that I do with LGBTQ plus people, I don't ask the 2-step approach because sometimes it's not appropriate. But this is the way that we're doing it. This will allow people to identify as being trans without telling you that they're trans. So the first example here represents people that are cisgender, right? So their sex assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity, versus this example reflects a person that is gender diverse. So they've selected their sex assigned at birth as male, and one of the following options, or they may have selected all of them, right? And so this would be a gender diverse person. And this is a simple example for what we're seeing currently in our country where people don't feel comfortable disclosing their transgender identity. This is a way that you could use the two-step approach. This is actually a transgender woman, but she has not said that because she may be fearful of it. But if you use the two-step approach, this is how you could identify someone. So that's why we would recommend it. We also got intersex, a question about a diagnosis of an intersex trait added to it as well. So I'm getting close to time, so I'm going to quickly move through some of the research I'm doing. It's just going to be a quick snapshot. We're in data collection, so I can't really share any results with you, but you can see what I'm currently doing. So I have a new R01 that's focused on really redesigning how we measure the caregiver experience. And so this is for the next 5 years, we'll be doing this and really thinking about the diverse relationship types. Maybe you're a neighbor, maybe you're a friend, maybe you're a roommate, and really also thinking about the health and care need experience. So we're in the process right now, just in AIM 1. So this is the work, Rainbows of Caring, we're doing. We also have the RISE registry, Research Inclusion Supports Equity. It's the first NIH-supported research registry for sexual and gender minorities experiencing memory loss or living with Alzheimer's disease, or who are a caregiver. And so the hope is this registry, it's already being used by researchers to recruit from. The next study I have is an Alzheimer's Association funded study. This is to support me to build a cohort eventually that focuses on cognitive aging. And so we're recruiting diverse sexual and gender minorities and taking that example, what I did with the TICS, the telephone interview with for cognitive status, and expanding it to a larger sample. Finally, I have a study from funded by Michael J. Fox that we're currently recruiting for. We're recruiting LGBTQ+ people and their caregivers who are impacted by Parkinson's disease. We also have a survey that's going out to healthcare professionals to look at inclusion of LGBTQ+ people in their care settings. So that's happening right now. I already shared this study that we published recently. So I'm going to close with, I shared with you about SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity. I really encourage you, if you have questions or think about ways to include this. I shared some research. I hope what you take away from this is also what we're seeing across our country is a need for us to speak up as much as possible. Think about advocacy, think about supporting caregivers, families of choice, and ensuring that services are more inclusive. This will result in things being inclusive for everybody. And so that's why we're doing it. And then if you know junior people that want to work in this space, please mentor and fund them. We need more researchers to do this work. These are all of my mentors and my acknowledgements, and I'm ready for questions. Yeah.
Hi, this is so interesting. Thank you for this talk.
Yeah, my pleasure.
One thing that stood out to me is the differences between gay cis men and other LGBTQ members. So I was like thinking what might be the reason for that. So I have a very basic question. Did you control for socioeconomic status?
In the, so for the Burfus one, right, with a subjective cognitive decline, we did, right? I think we controlled for education and income. So yeah. I think that even when we control for that though, there's other underlying things that are happening, right, that we can't account for. My hypothesis around it is of privilege within the LGBTQ+ community and sort of access to all types of, so maybe we control for education and income, but what about some other social resources or other pieces that might right? Or even access, I think we controlled for healthcare, like health insurance, right? But BRFIS has only so much detail. So there may be something different happening, or what if it's exposure to stress or whatever's contributing, right, to Alzheimer's disease or memory loss. And we don't know if there's a difference in the exposure to whatever that is. And so while we're trying to control for it, I think that it raises questions that we need to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. How about others?
We always flip the first two questions.
They won't let the faculty ask.
Yeah, so.
Oh, okay.
we're waiting for
It's not like we're being
students to ask.
quiet.
Oh, okay, okay. It's like another student's got to volunteer.
I actually.
Okay. Yeah, I love it.
I was thinking about bisexual,
Yeah.
cis women. I don't know a lot about the research about that but I think about the mechanism, because sometimes bisexual, they might be in a heterosexual relationship, and so that's very interesting to me that they still have like a very high, do you have any hypotheses?
So what we see in other outcomes are greater health disparities among bisexual people, just more broadly. So greater health risks, like we see higher rates of tobacco use, binge drinking, many other kind of, where I think these are behaviors of people coping with adversity and stress. What's unique for bisexual people when we think about within both communities, right? Yes, they could be in a heterosexual or a homosexual relationship. In both communities, it's stigmatized. So heterosexuals are sort of like, you're still kind of gay, right? Is sort of the framing. And then in a homosexual, it's like, well, you also like the opposite sex. So you're not really gay, right? So when you're kind of in those margins of like, not purely heterosexual, I'm not purely gay, where do I fit? And so that's what a lot of the research has been hypothesizing, is that this results in a lot of stress and adversity, right, for bisexuals, and that might be explaining why we're seeing concerns. And it was something I was hoping, I don't have the large enough sample for bisexual women to look at it, but I think they were explaining a lot of why we saw for that group higher rates of dementia, but the numbers just aren't large enough to do subgroup analyses.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now faculty can ask.
Yeah.
So I have 1,000 questions, but I want to ask them.
Okay.
It's just one. I'm really curious from a life course perspective, when you track things like when people transition, for example, how their peer groups change, incidents of bullying, for example, children's vulnerabilities, as opposed to when you make a transition later on in adulthood, because I'm interested in the kind of developmental part that may show up as aging. And
Yeah.
I do want to talk to you about that cognitive aging, because if you don't collect enough points, well, I'll get into that later.
Yeah.
But
No, that's a really, we haven't, I think we need more, so especially with our transgender community, we raise this with bisexual people, right? So for our trans community, it's also, I think, life course experiences differ when you transition, right? When you are taking gender affirming hormones or having gender affirming procedures. But there's even a broader piece. If you pass or don't pass, has an impact on their experiences. And so I think these are things we can't even get the numbers for just transgender people alone that maybe are a homogenous group, right? And so looking at some of these diverse experiences over the life course, I think will be very important. And I think of this a lot. So in Las Vegas, I go to a large number of older trans women get together weekly, and I go. And I think about many of them are actually transitioning later in life, and they have a lot more economic resources. Often they leave a marriage, right? They have all of this support so that they don't have to face the adversity to be able to be who they are. Versus, let's think about someone in early life that's also trying to start a career, trying to have a family, all of those pieces, and navigating their gender identity with that would be very different. So yeah, I hope someone will, it's so much to learn, right? And to like really work with the community. I think there's so many opportunities to explore this deeper, especially from a life course perspective, and we need it.
Yeah, I was thinking about your registries, for example. You know, when you begin to do pilot studies or, you know, using the registries, you may get some insights given that you are establishing registries.
Yeah.
You could
One of my
explain
mentees is using a cohort. It's a medical record again, but we're going to be looking at, it's among transgender people called the Strong cohort. It's out of like Georgia, and I think it's tapping into some of the West Coast now, and maybe DC. I forget the other state, but they are going to be looking at some of these pieces, like when was gender affirming hormone initiated, right? When different aspects of that to try to answer some of these questions. But again, we need someone to fund like life course studies, right? Which is so hard to get the funding for, or someone to do it in early life and then partner with an aging researcher. But yeah, it would be so cool to look at.
You're out of time. That
Ah,
was so wonderful.
okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.